So last week we got our first look at AMD's new Ryzen 5 9600X and Ryzen 7 9700X processors, and I think it's fair to say I wasn't that impressed with what we saw. That said though, reviews were very mixed, and that's despite, for the most part, reporting pretty similar performance data, at least based on what I saw, and that meant very minimal gains in games with mixed productivity performance. Now, the mixed reception from reviewers left viewers and readers very confused, with some asking the question, are these new Zen 5 processors good or bad? And it's a fair enough question. How good or bad the 9600X and 9700X are, it depends. Yes, as usual, it depends. It's quite clear now that reviews that mostly focused on server workloads, development software, and AI-type benchmarks found Zen 5 to be generally excellent, offering good performance gains over Zen 4 with improved power efficiency. But reviews that focused on gaming, and I suppose more typical desktop productivity workloads, stuff like video editing for example, found Zen 5 to be extremely underwhelming. That said, there was also some confusion around just how efficient Zen 5 is for these tasks when compared to Zen 4. And that is something I will be addressing in today's video, along with a range of other Zen 5 related misconceptions and misinformation. In a nutshell though, the Zen 5 architecture hasn't been designed with gaming and general desktop usage in mind. Rather, AMD developed it for the EPYC server processors. And this is why server and development workloads generally saw impressive gains. However, AMD still heavily marketed Zen 5 towards gamers. They absolutely want you to buy it, and they made a number of gaming-related performance claims that have proven simply to be untrue, hence our disappointment with the product. For example, during their tech day, AMD provided official slides claiming that the 9700X provided gaming leadership over the 14700K with 13% better performance on average. At least that's what they showed in their slide. And in the same slide, they also showed much better productivity performance, up to 42% greater performance in Handbrake, none of which unfortunately turned out to be true. So, by setting the wrong expectations with gamers, AMD has ultimately set Zen 5 up to fail. And it's been hard for a lot of people, namely those who are fans of the AMD brand, to accept that Zen 5, at least for them, is a flop. It is a major disappointment for gaming. As a result, we've seen all kinds of coping, let's say, claims of up to 40% efficiency gains, which simply aren't true. And we've heard that if you enable stuff like PBO, the 9700X becomes an absolute monster, offering massive performance gains that can also be seen in games. There's just a lot of confusion, and it was impossible to head off all of the bad information, the misinformation in our initial review, because you don't really know how these things are going to be interpreted, how things are going to turn out. That said, we did provide stuff like PBO testing in our initial review and showed that it doesn't boost gaming performance, and the 9700X really isn't an efficiency monster, especially when talking about gaming. So today we're taking another crack at it and producing what's almost going to be a re-review of the 9600X and 9700X, but it is going to be much more interesting than that. But yeah, I will be focusing mostly on the 9700X. The aim is to address, as I said, misinformation, a lot of the misinformation we're seeing surrounding these new products. And look, while we're not going to convince any of the fanboys, this content absolutely is not for them. They can carry on like pork chops in the comments and we'll just ignore them. And the adults in the room will, clear things up. And that's basically the goal of this content. So if you're confused about what you've been seeing about Zen 5, hopefully this video will make it a bit easier to understand what Zen 5 is and what it offers from a gaming and general desktop user perspective. So with that little disclaimer out of the way, let's get into it. Now, a massive oversight in most day one reviews was the comparison between the 105 watt 7700X and the 65 watt 9700X. Realistically, if you're going to claim big efficiency gains for Zen 5, you should be comparing it with 65 watt Zen 4, so that is exactly what we'll be doing today. And starting with the Cinebench data, we see that the 9700X is just 7% faster than the 7700, so that is not a big uplift for multi-core performance. That said, you can enable PBO, and that does boost the 9700X by a further 9%, though it also increases power usage and quite substantially. In fact, if we measure power draw from the EPS 12-volt rails using Elmore Labs' power measurement device, we see that the 7700 and 9700X consumed the exact same level of power, meaning for the same power draw, the 9700X was just 7% faster. We also see that while PBO boosted performance by a further 9%, it increased power usage by over 70%. So that is very poor efficiency scaling. This data also reveals why comparing the 9700X to the 7700X for power efficiency is extremely misleading. The 7700X is just 5% faster than the 7700 in this test, and yet it sucks down 45% more power. Just quickly, here's the single core data. The 7700 is just 5% slower than the 7700X, which suggests it's not going to be that much slower in basically all workloads, productivity, and gaming. That said, the 9700X is 15% faster than the 7700 here, which is an impressive uplift. Now, the 7-zip file manager test is a good example of how the 9700X can be a bit underwhelming, even for all-core productivity workloads. Compressing, and in particular decompressing, are common workloads for most desktop users, and sadly Zen 5 kind of sucks here, at least relative to the 2-year-old parts it's meant to be replacing. For the compression test, the 9700X was 2% slower than the 7700, and enabling PBO did nothing here. Then for decompression work, the 9700X and 7700 were neck and neck. The newer Zen 5 part was offering a mere 1% performance improvement, and again, PBO does nothing here. The 9700X was 7% faster than the 7700 in the Blender Open Data benchmark, so the same margin that we saw in Cinebench, and again, both parts consumed the same level of power. Enabling PBO did boost performance by 11%, but again, it did so at the cost of massive power draw. We're also seeing a 13% improvement for the 9700X over the 7700 in the Corona 10 benchmark, so a nice boost there for the same power draw. Now, enabling PBO did deliver some serious gains, boosting performance by a further 15%, and now the 9700X is a massive 29% faster than the 7700. That said, it uses around 80% more power, so while the performance uplift here is certainly impressive, it's not that great in terms of power efficiency. Moving on to the Adobe Photoshop 2024 benchmark, we find the 9700X is 6% faster than the 7700, again for the same power draw. So a nice little bump there, but nothing amazing. Sadly, PBO only improved performance by 2.5% in this example, and again it did destroy the processor's efficiency for almost no performance gain. We do see a 7% improvement for the 9700X over the 7700 in Adobe Premiere Pro 2024, so that's decent. Though in this example, PBO did nothing to improve performance further. Okay, let's quickly blast our way through the gaming benchmarks, starting with Baldur's Gate 3. The 9700X is just 4% faster than the 7700, and PBO provides just an additional frame. So PBO does next to nothing in this example, and that's typical for most gaming benchmarks. For Baldur's Gate 3, I measured the average power usage from the EPS 12-volt rails, and here we find some very revealing data. Despite being celebrated by many for its incredible power efficiency, the 9700X actually used 35% more power than the 7700 in this test, to deliver a mere 4% FPS boost. In fact, power draw was similar to the 7700X, and this is what we showed in our original review when looking at the total system usage. So this data is accurate. Also, we saw PBO only boosted the FPS by 1% in this example, and yet that resulted in a 5% increase in power usage. So really negligible on both fronts there. The 9700X was really disappointing in our Last of Us Part 1 benchmark, coming in 2% slower than the 7700, and again PBO is next to useless, only boosting performance here by 1%, and this is a max PBO result. So that wasn't even enough to match the 7700. Now in this example, the 9700X and 7700 consumed the same level of power, which is what you'd typically expect to see. So that means the 9700X is technically a little less efficient than the 7700 in The Last of Us Part 1 because it was a bit slower. Also, despite not really resulting in any extra performance, PBO blew out the power usage in this example by 27%. Moving on to Cyberpunk 2077 Phantom Liberty, we find the 9700X is just 3% faster than the 7700, and again, PBO is useless here, failing to improve performance at all. Despite that though, PBO still managed to increase power usage, this time by 15%. We also see that for that extra 3% FPS boost, the 9700X consumed 2% more power than the 7700. So in this example, efficiency is much the same. For the rest of the games tested, I didn't gather any power data, so we'll just quickly go over the FPS numbers. In Hogwarts Legacy, the 9700X was 7% faster than the 7700, which is a decent gain. Not amazing, but compared to what we have seen, I'll go with decent. PBO though, again proved to be pretty useless for gaming, improving performance here by a mere percent. ACC is a very cache sensitive game, so I suspect the increased L1 capacity is playing a key role in the performance gains seen here for Zen 5. The 9700X is an impressive 18% faster than the 7700, though once again PBO does nothing. Still, this is a great result for the 9700X, and we saw similar gains with the 9600X. Sadly, however, in our 13 game sample, this data is an extreme outlier. It's certainly accurate data, but it's by no means representative of typical gaming gains. The 9700X does well in Spider-Man Remastered, offering a 7% performance uplift over the 7700, so that's certainly one of the better results we've come across. We're also looking at a 7% boost in Homeworld 3, which is a positive sign, though PBO once again proved to be pretty useless for gamers. A Plague Tale Requiem saw a mild 4% gain for the 9700X, so nothing to really get excited about here, and of course PBO was next to useless. I should note that in my 9700X review, the Counter-Strike 2 data was a little bit off. The Zen 5 processor was reported to perform a bit better than it actually does, so that was an error in the initial testing and I did correct it for the 9600X review, but I just wanted to make that clear. With the correct numbers, the 9700X is just 3% faster, and again PBO didn't help here. The new Zen 5 processors really suck in Starfield, and here we see that the 9700X is 4% slower than the 7700, so a very disappointing result. Moreover, PBO only improved the 9700X's position by 2%, so not enough to match the 7700, though I guess you could say it was close enough. These new Zen 5 processors also suck in Horizon Forbidden West. Here the 9700X was 5% slower than the 7700, and we're barely seeing a percentage point gained with maximum PBO enabled. The 9700X was 2% faster than the 7700 in Hitman 3, but again PBO didn't really offer anything. Then we have Watch Dogs Legion, where the 9700X is back to sucking, coming in 3% slower than the 7700, and we're looking at just a 1% increase with PBO enabled. So here it is, the 9700X is 3% faster than the 7700, so a 3% gaming improvement for the same or at least very similar power usage. Also, for all the fuss that has been made about the 9700X and PBO, seeing just a 1% gain overall is super disappointing, and I'll talk more about that in a moment. So, nothing has really changed from our original review of the 9700X in terms of performance, and of course the same also applies to the 9600X. For those interested, the graphs did also include the 9600X and the Ryzen 5 7600, but the results are pretty similar to what we're seeing between the 9700X and 7700, so rather than repeat all of that stuff over and over again, I just focused on the Ryzen 7 part to make it a bit easier to get through all of that benchmark data. But of course, you do have the Ryzen 5 stuff there if you want to go and review that for yourself. What we have confirmed here is that for gaming and desktop applications, at least the ones that we tested, the 9700X generally isn't that much faster than the 7700, and both CPUs generally use the same level of power. Now, a comment I saw more than a few times on our 9700X and 9600 reviews went something like this. I just came from another review and they showed much better gaming performance. What's going on there? Who's right? So let me quickly address this. And no, I'm not going to call out any reviewers directly. I'm not going to name anyone. I respect the work everyone has done here. It is a crazy week at getting these reviews done, and some media outlets didn't even have a week. So I, of all people, can certainly appreciate how difficult it is to get these reviews done. With that said, I have noticed a few things. The reviews that have claimed stronger gaming performance gains for Zen 5 than what we showed, and they almost always tested very few games. in some examples 4 or less, which in my opinion is unsatisfactory for a review. Again, as I said, I know there's time crunches and stuff like that there, but we knew this stuff was coming. You can update all your data beforehand, and adding a CPU or 2 to that data shouldn't be a problem. So in my opinion, at minimum, reviewers should be testing 10 games. And this is what PowerUp did, for example. And I'm naming them because they did an excellent job. So this is a highly positive call out. Well, I suppose it's not a call out, is it? It's recognition. They tested 10 games, and 4 of the games were also retested with ray tracing enabled. And they found that the 9700X was on average just 2% faster than the 7700. So that is mighty close to the 3% that I got. They also found that maximum PBO boosted gaming performance by an average of 1%, which is exactly what I found. Now, quite shockingly, they also found that in terms of gaming efficiency, the Ryzen 7 7700 was 17% more efficient in terms of frames per watt when compared to the 9700X. That's right, the Zen 4 processor was actually more efficient. That's crazy, but also lines up with what I found when looking at power consumption across a few of the games I tested. Admittedly, not the full range, but I did go back and look at 3. They also found that PBO decreased gaming efficiency by 7%, which again lines up with what I saw. So, if you've seen a review that's claiming the 9700X is much faster than, let's say, 5% on average when compared to the 7700 or 7700X, it really doesn't matter. Just check how many games they tested with, and then have a look at which games provided those outliers. Because I firmly believe if you test a dozen games or more like what I did, you'll find the same thing. That is, low single-digit gains overall. On that note, AMD has finally updated their review guide to include the 7700X, and they found on average across 23 games that the 9700X was just 5% faster. Oddly, however, of the 23 games that AMD did test, just 3 of them were released in the last 2 years. I was really surprised to find that AMD-sponsored titles such as Starfield, they weren't included in AMD's own data, but given our results for Starfield, for example, I suppose I can guess why they skipped it. But of course, the takeaway here being that AMD's own internal testing found that the 9700X is on average just 5% faster than the 7700X. And I believe their data to be, heavily cherry-picked. So that being the case, any independent review claiming well over 5% on average for gaming probably needs to reevaluate the list of games that they test with. Okay, let's shift gears here and talk about the elephant in the room, PBO. I'm going to blame my German mate DeBauer for this whole mess. No, that's not true. I'm not blaming DeBauer. DeBauer does excellent work and is highly respected in this field, so no shade thrown at DeBauer. But, this whole thing's your fault, mate. What are you doing? No, rather the problem here seems to be people jumping to conclusions without fully watching DeBauer's video and absorbing all the great information that he laid out for you. What DeBauer did was, in his title, he said the 9700X is very efficient, which I don't completely agree with, but then it's also not wrong. It highly depends on the workload, so there's probably no point arguing about that. It's both right and wrong, in my opinion, depending on how you're looking at it. DeBauer also claimed the 9700X is held back by power limits, which is also sort of true. I mean, yeah, it's a depend situation. It's not always true, and removing the power limits absolutely decimates power efficiency. That much is true. That said, DeBauer was only advocating for a 10 to 20 watt increase, as he thought maybe this would help boost the performance of the 9700X to a degree where it's noticeably, it's better than the 7700X, I guess is what he was getting at. Like, they're similar now. Give it a bit more power, that'll widen that gap. And what he did say was, by widening that gap a bit more, if that's indeed what they can achieve with a bit more power, it'll help justify the increased price of these parts. Of course, the problem is, it is quite difficult to convey all the nuances of this topic in a YouTube title. So again, DeBauer did nothing wrong here. The problem is people just being lazy, I hate to say it, or worse, deliberately deceptive because they just want to spin a certain narrative. Claiming that you have to enable PBO to fully unleash the 9700X is a bit of a white lie. And DeBauer showed that for certain workloads, PBO can indeed provide massive performance gains in the realm of 20%, which is awesome. However, he also showed that for almost 20% more performance, you have to spend about 80% more power. So there goes your efficiency out the window. And he also showed multiple examples that PBO does nothing for gaming. And DeBauer himself was very clear on this. He stated that fact. And he did so while testing his PBO results in 4 games. And in those 4 games, he found that on average, the max PBO boost only resulted in 1.5% performance uplift. So, that's very much in line with my own testing and that of others such as Tech Power Up. Now, on the topic of power efficiency, the thing that almost all reviewers universally got wrong, and in a way I guess you can include us in this one, was to compare the 65-watt 9700X and 9600X with the 105-watt Zen 4 parts, and then claim Zen 5 is very efficient, or phenomenally efficient, as I saw at least one reviewer claiming. Thankfully, I made no such claims, but my original review did omit the 65-watt Zen 4 parts, which I've since included in this very video, so I've redeemed myself. Also, in my defense, I was pretty quick to pick up on this mistake, making a note of it over on Twitter and issuing a correction in our 9600X review, which was released a day after the 9700X review. I was also mindful of the 65-watt Zen 4 parts in my original review, and knowing that they are significantly more efficient than the 105-watt parts, I didn't make a big deal out of Zen 5's efficiency improvements, knowing that it just wouldn't stack up nearly as well against those non-X parts, like the 7700 and 7600. Now, another YouTuber who goes by the name of Daniel Owen picked up on the 65-watt versus 105-watt thing after our 9600X review went live. At least I think that's what alerted him to the fact that there was a bit of funniness going on there. Funniness? Yep, we'll go with that. But anyway, Daniel also made his own very keen observations, which basically all reviewers also missed, so full credit to Daniel on this one. What Daniel noticed was that the 9700X is a 65-watt part, which is what everyone noticed, and therefore it does make sense to compare it with a 65-watt Zen 4 counterpart, and that's what a lot of us didn't notice. So in this instance, 9700X versus 7700, and when you do that, you realize a few things, or at least Daniel did. We've also already talked about the 9700X, how it doesn't look nearly as efficient, but Daniel pointed out that the MSRP of the 9700X, it actually hasn't been lowered. We've all been fooled. That's because while the 7700X launched at $400 US, the 7700 arrived 3 months later at just $330 US, which is actually $30 US less than that of the 9700X MSRP. But worse than that, the 7700 came with the Wraith Prism box cooler, meaning you didn't really need to spend any additional money on a cooler if you didn't want to. The 9700X, on the other hand, that doesn't just cost $30 US more at the MSRP, but it also does away with the cooler. So, see this little box? There's no cooler with this CPU. The cooler's gone. You're paying more and you're losing the cooler. And that means that the 9700X and the 9600X are even worse value than we originally thought. So, that's not good. Now, another bit of information I've seen circulate in the comments section of the Zen 5 reviews has to do with memory support. Apparently, some reviewers tested with DDR5 6400, claiming this is the new sweet spot for Zen 5, but that simply isn't true, and I'm not sure why this was ever claimed in the first place, because AMD were very clear in their review guide that Zen 5 memory support is exactly the same as Zen 4. There are no improvements there. AMD even stressed that the maximum Infinity Fabric speed that most Zen 5 CPUs will be able to handle, or really, I suppose they're insinuating that all Zen 5 CPUs will be able to handle, is 2000 megahertz, the same fabric speed that Zen 4 was able to handle. So going beyond 2000 megahertz means that you will be playing the silicon lottery there. I expect that quite a few chips will probably do it and remain stable, but there'll also be plenty that won't. Something I've seen people saying as well is that it's easier to hit DDR5 6000 on Zen 5 processors. Again, memory compatibility and support at the processor level has not changed. Motherboard BIOS support might have improved over time as AM5's aged, but this is not an inherent Zen 5 feature. It's also way too early for reviewers to make these claims, as it really takes months to gather that kind of data. Most reviewers have a sample size of 1, maybe 2 CPUs to go on, and based on that, you can't make these kind of predictions about whether things like memory support and whether it's easier to hit certain frequencies has improved, because you could just be dealing with a really good CPU, good silicon quality CPU that's able to achieve frequencies that probably or possibly most CPUs won't be able to handle, especially if AMD themselves are telling you that Infinity Fabric, still 2000 megahertz, that's what you should be shooting for, and they even said DDR5 6000 is the sweet spot. And while we're on this topic of silicon quality and all that, it's worth noting that PBO, in particular stuff like undervolting and overclocking, they're highly silicon dependent. So while it might be really nice to see a chip that can boost and overclock really well, you can't just simply extrapolate that and say that all Zen 5 CPUs will handle this amazing overclock. The silicon lottery is very much a thing, especially when considering stuff like tweaking and tuning. And while we're talking memory, Zen 5, like Zen 4, can run up to DDR5 8000, but doing so is pointless, as performance is generally the same as DDR5 6000. I've seen some people suggesting that AMD should have provided faster memory, because I think they're assuming that the Zen 5 IMC is better, but they should have provided faster memory because that would have made Zen 5 look better and more impressive in reviews. No, it would not have done any of that. That is, I don't know what that is. But yeah, so you can't run, or you shouldn't run DDR5 8000, because generally it results in the same performance as DDR5 6000 anyway, especially if you're using lower latency DDR5 6000. And the reason 8000 isn't a lot faster as you would expect it to be is because you have to decouple the integrated memory controller from the memory frequency, and that increases latency. Now, generally speaking, the additional bandwidth you get with DDR5 8000 is enough to overcome the latency penalty, but as I said, as a result, the performance ends up leveling out anyway, so you get about the same performance. There could be some exceptions to that. You may see in more memory sensitive games, or sorry, more memory bandwidth sensitive examples where 8000 is a bit faster, but there's also latency sensitive examples where 6000 is faster. But from the testing I've done and the testing I've seen from others is that overall DDR5 6000 and DDR5 8000 deliver the same results on both Zen 4 and Zen 5. And that being the case, you might as well just get the cheaper DDR5 6000 memory. Now, another question I've seen a lot of you asking in the comments is, will the upcoming AMD 800 series motherboards improve performance of the Zen 5 processors? Now, although I haven't tested those boards, I can tell you the answer will be no. Performance between 600 and 800 series boards will be identical. A memory support won't change either. Again, the limit there is the CPU's memory controller, not the motherboards. At least not a good motherboard. So, is Zen 5 in the form of the 9700X and 9600X a flop, as we put it last week? For gamers, I've got to say absolutely. You're not getting any real efficiency gains. Not that gamers care deeply about efficiency gains unless they're really massive, and performance overall is much the same. So that means after 2 years, you're faced with having to pay a 20% or greater price premium for basically the same performance. I think most of you will agree that's not good. In fact, it's actually quite bad. Now, having said that, at some point in the future, it's very possible that I will be recommending Zen 5 processors. So that's going to probably confuse a few people when they see our day one reviews where we say it's a flop and a disaster, and then we ultimately, or potentially, end up recommending them. I suppose that depends on how Intel's Arrow Lake series plays out. But what I mean by this is, I expect at some point in the future, the Ryzen 7000 series will be phased out, and the Ryzen 9000 parts will drop in price, at which point, sure, they're an option on AM5. And at that point in time, they could very well be the best option. That, however, still doesn't change the fact that the AM5 platform won't have seen a good step forward after 2 years. It just means that Zen 5 will have filtered down to effectively replace Zen 4, so sure. Right now, though, you shouldn't even entertain the 9600X or 9700X. They really shouldn't be on your radar. Just get the Zen 4 equivalent, because for desktop workloads, they're basically the same thing at a much better price. Now, just lastly, I want to point out the obvious. Hardware Unboxed is a gaming-focused channel. You won't find a single 40 application benchmark on this channel, but you will find countless big 40 plus gaming benchmarks comparing various CPUs and GPUs. So that being the case, it should make sense that we review new CPUs from the perspective of a gamer, with some general desktop productivity mixed in there, but really the focus is on gaming. And that being the case, don't come to us for Linux-based server benchmarks or development stuff and AI benchmarks. We've never done those, and I can't imagine we ever will. Coming here expecting that sort of thing is a bit like going to a basketball game, let's say, and looking around and getting confused. Why is everyone here into basketball? Why are they excited to see a basketball game? Why are they excited by cricket? Or at least why, in this very moment, at this basketball game, why are they not excited by cricket? Well, it's because they're two different things. Of course, you can be interested in both sports, just as you can be interested in both server and gaming benchmarks. But I guess my point is you don't go to a basketball game expecting the basketball players to be playing cricket. That'd be weird. But yeah, we're not playing basketball with a cricket bat, though that does sound like a fun time. Anyway, I guess what I'm trying to say is, or I think I said it, Hardware Unboxed, gaming focused channel, not server workloads. So yeah, don't claim we've reviewed the CPUs wrong because we didn't look at server benchmarks, because we're a gaming focused channel. That's how we review stuff. And again, I think it's important to point out that AMD approached us to review these processors and a lot of the tech media and said, hey, we've got these new Zen 5 processors. This is how they do in gaming. 9700X much better than 14700K. Would you like to review it? And then they've advertised these to be really great gaming and desktop processors. The information is on their website. So that's the angle we've come at it from, and it makes sense because that's how AMD's advertising them to you guys. But anyway, I think I've addressed most of the bad information around the 9600X and 9700X, and yeah, no more dumb analogies. I don't think they'll be required. So for those of you confused by all of the nonsense surrounding this release, I hope the explanations given in this video have helped. And if they have, maybe give it a like, subscribe, do all that stuff, because we do have some Ryzen 9 reviews coming up, and I think they're going to go a bit differently. I'm not stating they're going to be better or anything like that. I'm no indication of better or worse. I just think because of things like TDPs and whatnot being similar to the Zen 4 parts will help with some of the confusion, and reviewers have had a bit more time to wrap their head around Zen 5, so that'll be interesting. Anyway, that stuff's coming up later in the week. It is also, just for those of you who are going to comment, it is 1:30 in the morning, so that's why I look like crap. More so than usual. Very tired, but I wanted to get this done and squeeze it in before I had to get on with that Ryzen 9 testing. And this was my only opportunity, so I've stayed up way too late and filmed this video. And now I'm rambling because I'm really tired. I don't know, like, subscribe, do the float plane, Patreon stuff. I'm your host, Steve. See you again next time.